Welcome to At Midnight, the late-night dive into history, myths, and legends. Across old tablets, mountain stories, river works, and rising seas, flood tales keep asking how a world begins again after water has had its say. They rarely agree on the answer, which is inconvenient for anyone hoping ancient people held a single meeting and compared boat plans. This is At Midnight. Let's step into the dark. The story begins as a piece of clay, broken at its edges, carrying marks made by a hand long gone. That is a useful place to begin, because the oldest flood stories do not arrive as a tidy message sealed against doubt. They arrive as tablets, fragments, copies, and arguments about what a damaged line may once have said. A flood, in such a record, has already passed through several kinds of weather. It has passed through memory, writing, copying, burial, discovery, and the patient work of people trying to read marks pressed into wet clay. One of these witnesses preserves part of the story called Atra-hasis. It is an old Babylonian flood tablet, and it does not offer a modern reader the comfort of a single complete book. Its surviving lines belong to a much larger mythic world, one in which divine decisions have consequences for human beings who may not be told the whole plan. The name Atra-hasis belongs to the man at the center of this episode. His name is often understood as exceptionally wise, though the scene that reaches us has less to do with grand wisdom than with receiving a warning in a form that can be denied. The god Aya has learned of a coming disaster, but a divine assembly has placed him under an obligation not to reveal its decision openly. So the warning takes an odd route. Aya speaks toward a reed wall or enclosure, as though he is addressing the wall itself. The arrangement is clever in the old mythic manner. Atra-hasis can hear what must be heard. Aya can preserve the appearance that he has not simply broken his word to the other gods. It is not a public proclamation. It is a secret shaped to sound like something else. The reed wall matters because it makes the scene intimate and indirect. There is no gathered crowd, no king issuing commands from a platform, no reliable alarm system with a bell at the end of a rope. There is a man close enough to woven reeds to overhear a god. The myth does not pause to explain how a reed wall became a participant in divine diplomacy. Old stories often expect their listeners to accept such arrangements with better manners than a court clerk might have managed. Aya's message includes directions for a boat. Even that practical word needs caution. The tablet is evidence for an instruction scene and for boat building directions. It is not a complete engineering manual, and it is not a report filed after a local flood. The boat exists inside a narrative about divine decisions, danger, survival, and a world made unstable by powers larger than its human inhabitants. Its details gain their force from that setting. The physical tablet has its own history, separate from the story it preserves. A later fragment in the British Museum is a Neo-Assyrian bilingual copy of the Atra-hasis myth from the library of Ashur-Bani-pal. The old Babylonian tablet and that later copy are not interchangeable objects. They come from different periods, and each survives in its own condition. The later witness shows that the tale was copied and read long after an earlier written form had been made. It does not give a neat date for the first composition of the tradition, any more than a late copy of a song tells us the exact evening when someone first sang it. That distinction is quiet but important. Ancient literature can be old in more than one sense. A particular tablet has a date. A copying tradition has a history. A story may have older forms that are no longer present in the ground or the archive. The evidence lets us say some things and leaves other things standing just beyond the light. The uncertain edges are not a failure of the story. They are part of the story's modern life. There's a small irony in this. The myth concerns a warning that must travel by an indirect route. Its modern survival also reaches us indirectly, through clay that has endured only in parts, and through readers who reconstruct meaning with care. The ancient reed enclosure is not the same as a museum fragment, of course. Still, both make the message feel contingent. It arrives because something held long enough for another person to receive it. Clay does not permit a reader to forget this distinction. The material object is neither a transparent window on a remote event, nor a useless obstacle. It preserves the scene in a form that requires patience, leaving the old warning present, but never entirely unguarded. The episode does not ask modern readers to decide whether the god's words were literally overheard through reeds. It asks them to enter a world where divine speech has rules and loopholes. Knows a decision has been made. Atra-hasis is near enough to receive a warning. The wall allows the god to speak without appearing to speak directly to the man. The scene is strange, but not careless. Its strangeness is the mechanism by which the story moves. For the people within the episode, however, uncertainty has a sharper shape. Atra-hasis has received an instruction without being given a comfortable explanation of the world around it. Something is coming. A god has found a narrow path through an oath. Reeds have become the unlikely cover for a warning. And before the story can tell what the waters will do, it asks for something much more ordinary and difficult. A vessel must be made. Making a vessel is where a hidden warning becomes a burden that cannot be set aside. Atra-hasis has heard I's guarded words, and the myth now presses him toward work. The instructions belong to a world in which human beings live beneath divine arguments they cannot fully inspect. He is not invited into the council that made the decision. He is given enough knowledge to act, which is sometimes the more exhausting gift. The surviving flood episode connects I's warning with directions for a boat. It is tempting to fill the gaps with a familiar sequence. A man understands every purpose, gathers every creature in a precise order, and calmly prepares, while everyone else remains unaware. The available Atra-hasis material does not require that tidy picture. It gives an instruction scene practical preparation, and a larger myth whose surviving witnesses do not form one stable, complete volume. The gaps should remain gaps. They are not empty seats waiting for a later tradition to sit down in them. Still, the scene has an unmistakable human pressure. Building is slow. Materials have to be found, joined, lifted, and made to hold. A vessel is an answer to water only if its seams stay closed and its shape stays sound. The myth turns a divine secret into labor with hands. There is no need to imagine every hammer stroke to feel the change in scale. A warning spoken through reeds has become wood, fiber, pitch, weight, and time. I's indirectness also gives the episode its particular moral weather. The god has not simply stood beside Atra-hasis and said what will happen. He speaks around a promise, through an object that cannot answer back. The man who hears him must decide that the strange message deserves action. In many old narratives, knowledge arrives as a riddle, a dream, a bird, an omen, or an order that is only partly explained. Here it arrives with reeds between the speaker and the hearer. The arrangement is less like a public rescue and more like a narrow opening left in a closed door. The flood itself must not be treated as a plain historical forecast. Atra-hasis is a mythic figure in a Mesopotamian literary tradition. The tablet records a story about divine will and human survival. It does not establish that one worldwide inundation occurred, or that every later flood tale is a weather report with different names attached. Ancient Mesopotamia knew rivers, irrigation, rain, and the destructive force of water. A story can grow in a country of waterways without becoming a dated account of a single disaster. Nor does the boat become a universal emblem merely because boats recur elsewhere. A vessel is a useful solution within a flood narrative, rather as a roof is a useful solution within a rain narrative. Similar responses can invite comparison, but comparison is not the same as proof of a common source. For the moment, it is enough to remain beside Atra-hasis and the particular problem given to him. A god has warned him. Other gods have not been asked to agree, and preparation must happen before the reason for it becomes visible. There is restraint in the fragmentary record. It prevents the tale from hardening into an overconfident diagram. We cannot stand beside the original teller. We cannot recover every lost line by force of imagination. What remains is already substantial. I's divided loyalty, the reed enclosure, the threatened flood, and a boat that must be constructed under the pressure of withheld knowledge. That difference gives ordinary preparation an unusual moral weight. Atra-hasis does not need to understand the whole purpose of the boat before beginning it. The myth makes action depend on trust in a message delivered under constraint. Its tension lies less in a description of machinery than in the silence surrounding the work and the future it prepares for. The available evidence should keep the scene from becoming too smooth. The preserved episode supports boat directions. It does not give license to supply every missing arrangement from other flood stories. A narrator can imagine the broad demands of making a vessel, its weight, its closure, and the need to prepare it in time. But invented measurements, named cargoes, and a complete schedule would only disguise the limits of the tablet. A gap is not an invitation to borrow furniture from a different room. That restraint makes Atra-hasis more rather than less present. He remains a man confronted with an enormous assignment, whose full meaning is withheld. The story allows the listener to feel the imbalance between the scale of the divine decision and the scale of human work. A god can speak a warning around an oath. A human being must make something that floats. There is no need to make Atra-hasis calm in order to make him capable. The surviving material does not supply a private diary of his thoughts. It gives a mythic situation in which action follows a warning. The human interest comes from that fact alone. He must commit himself to work before the future is visible, while the God who helped him has done so by speaking in a way that preserves deniability. The same arrangement leaves room for a quiet moral complication. Aya's care for Atra-hasis is real within the episode, yet it is not an open challenge to the other gods. The warning passes through an exception rather than a public reversal. The divine world is not a single clear voice. It contains divided obligations, concealed knowledge, and consequences that humans must bear. This does not make the myth a hidden chronicle of a particular flood season. Its riverine setting and concern with water are enough to make the scene imaginable without turning it into a report. The story asks a different kind of question. What can one person do when an order from above has been made elsewhere, and the only mercy available arrives in guarded language? Mesopotamian literature returns to that pressure in another setting, with another survivor and another listener. The next account does not simply continue Atra-hasis as if an old tablet had been copied without alteration. It places the flood inside an epic, concerned with a different trouble, one that no vessel can finally keep away: the ordinary human fact of death. That trouble brings Gilgamesh to Uta-napishti, a survivor whose life has moved beyond the ordinary human limit. In Tablet 11 of the standard Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, the flood is not placed at the beginning of the world as a detached, ancient lesson. It is told by one man to another, late in an epic shaped by grief, travel, and Gilgamesh's unwilling discovery that strength does not cancel mortality. Gilgamesh has lost his companion, Enkidu, and has gone in search of a way around the fate that waits for human beings. His journey reaches Uta-napishti, the exceptional survivor. This is why the flood story has its peculiar ache in the epic. It is not only about water and escape. It is an account offered to someone who wants to know how another man came to possess a life unlike everyone else's. Uta-napishti begins with Shu-Rupak, an ancient city on the Euphrates. The gods, he says, had decided to bring a flood. The decision belongs to the divine world, but its effects will fall upon the city and the living things within reach of the waters. Aya, who knows the decision, discloses the secret to Uta-napishti. The secrecy echoes the earlier Atra-hasis episode, but the literary situation is now different. This is Uta-napishti's remembered speech inside Gilgamesh's long pursuit of an answer to death. That frame matters. An epic can contain an older-looking tale without asking its audience to mistake the tale for a separate chronicle. Uta-napishti speaks as a survivor recalling an event that explains his strange existence. Gilgamesh listens because the account appears to hold a key, perhaps even an exception, to the human condition. The flood is therefore both catastrophe within the remembered story and evidence in the larger conversation between two men. Aya's disclosure does not make Uta-napishti master of the situation. A secret warning is not control over the forces that prompted it. It does, however, leave him with work to do. The boat must be made. Living beings must be brought aboard according to the story's instructions. A city has been named, a decision has been made elsewhere, and a man has been given a task too large to make comforting sense. The Epic of Gilgamesh does not ask for the quiet practicality of a harbor account. Its boat and flood belong to a world in which gods argue, decree, regret, and act with the scale of forces that human beings cannot govern. Yet, Uta-napishti's telling remains full of concrete needs. A vessel has to hold. Supplies have to be arranged. Those who are to survive have to be gathered. The grandeur of the myth never entirely removes the problem of enclosed space and waiting. For Gilgamesh, the account has another edge. He has come to Uta-napishti because this survivor is set apart from the dead. The story that follows is not a cheerful recipe for gaining that condition. It is a memory of why this one person, after an event that altered the world of the epic, received a fate that no ordinary traveler can assume is available. The name Shu-Rup-Pak gives the recollection a place, but place does not turn the scene into a simple local record. Ancient cities can be named in mythic literature without the narrative becoming an excavator's field note. The city is where Uta-napishti's memory begins, where the god's decision approaches human life, and where a secret starts becoming an enormous practical demand. Uta-napishti's voice gives the scene another kind of distance. He is recounting a past that Gilgamesh cannot enter or test for himself. The listener can hear a survivor's account, but the account remains framed by the larger epic. That framing is not a defect. It is the reason the flood episode matters so much. Gilgamesh has found a man who appears to have crossed the boundary he fears, and the answer comes as a story rather than an instruction. Gilgamesh's need gives Uta-napishti's first words a patient severity. The survivor does not flatter the king's hope or offer a short path around grief. He begins with what happened at Shu-Rup-Pak, with a decision among gods and a warning given in secret. The sequence insists that his altered life had an origin, but not an origin a mortal seeker can command. Its details arise from that exceptional past. Aya's secret communication belongs to this remembered world of divine decisions. Uta-napishti does not learn that he has power over the future. He learns that the future has been decided without him. The warning makes him responsible for preparation, not for explaining the gods. This is close to the human pressure found in Atra-hasis, but the epic gives it a different listener. Gilgamesh hears every practical detail under the shadow of his own wish to escape death. The story is therefore not a promise that enough effort can defeat mortality. It is the history of one exception. Uta-napishti has become a figure whom Gilgamesh can question, but he has not become a model whose condition can be reproduced by effort alone. His account lets the younger man draw near to the possibility of life beyond death, then places that possibility inside events that cannot be summoned again at will. The boat's construction has a different weight when heard this way. It is not simply an object of rescue. It is the means by which Uta-napishti's past moves toward the condition that now puzzles Gilgamesh. The vessel links the named city to a survivor who stands outside the usual human end. Yet the link is narrative, not mechanical. Gilgamesh cannot hear about a boat and infer that he has been handed a route around death. Old epics are not always so accommodating. The account also slows the listener's attention. Before there are birds, a landing, or an offering, there is a man being told to act. He must turn a secret into preparation while the city remains behind him. The epic does not need to add every sound or gesture to make the situation heavy. A task has been assigned. The people who will be preserved must be gathered. The future is shut inside the making of a vessel. He speaks then, not as an official reporter, but as a man whose past has become the answer to Gilgamesh's question. The secret is only the first part of that past. Once it has been received, memory moves toward the labor of construction, the gathering of life, and the long period inside a vessel where no one can yet know whether land will return. Inside that vessel, the most dramatic work has already been done. The boat has been made. Living beings have been preserved according to Uta-napishti's account, and the waters have taken the world beyond its sides. The epic does not need to linger over every violent detail to make confinement feel strange. A vessel on boundless water has no ordinary horizon of work. Its passengers can only wait for a change they cannot command. When the waters begin to subside, the story turns to small tests. Uta-napishti releases birds to discover whether there is a place where life can settle again. The sequence is practical and patient. A bird can travel farther than an enclosed survivor. Its return, or its failure to return, becomes information. In a narrative shaped by enormous forces, this is a modest method. Send a living creature outward and learn from its movement. Eventually, the vessel comes to rest on Mount Nemush. The landing does not simply restore the old world. The world after a flood tale is rarely allowed to resume its habits without alteration. Uta-napishti makes an offering. The gesture belongs to the episode's relationship between human beings and the gods, a relationship damaged and rearranged by the decision that caused the flood. It is not merely a decorative closing scene, and it should not be made into a template that every other water story must follow. The consequence for Uta-napishti is stranger still. He and his wife receive a life apart from ordinary humanity. This is why Gilgamesh sought him. The survivor has not found a technique that can be copied at will. He has been granted an exceptional condition after an exceptional event. His immortality is less a prize anyone can pursue than a border, marking the distance between him and the man who has come asking questions. Gilgamesh must hear this with mixed hopes. The story proves that a human being can, in the epic's world, be set beyond death. It also shows how narrow and unrepeatable the path was. Uta-napishti's flood memory does not promise that grief can be defeated by determined travel. It explains why this one old survivor stands where he does, far from the ordinary pattern of loss. The birds and the offering are easy details to remember, perhaps because they give the flood a sequence of actions after the waters fall. But their literary work is more particular than their familiarity suggests. The birds make uncertainty visible without speeches about uncertainty. The offering marks a renewed relation with the divine order of the epic. The altered life of Uta-napishti returns the whole episode to Gilgamesh's original concern. A flood tale has become an argument about what survives, and about what survival can never quite repair. The account also preserves a calm irony. Gilgamesh has crossed a great distance in search of an answer that seems to stand before him in human form. Uta-napishti answers by recounting an event that makes ordinary answers inadequate. There was a boat, there was a landing, and there was a gift beyond the reach of common life. None of it makes mortality disappear for the listener. The period after the vessel comes to rest is important because it does not turn at once into ordinary life. The survivors have reached solid ground, but the story still has to settle the relation between human beings and the gods. The offering belongs to that unsettled moment. It is an act performed after preservation, not a casual note added because an old tale needs a ceremonial ending. The offering also prevents the landing from becoming merely geographical. Mount Nemush is a resting place in the account, but the gesture that follows returns attention to the divine order of the epic. The survivors have reached Earth. They have not stepped outside the conditions that governed their survival. That distinction leaves the ending solemn rather than secure, and keeps Uta-napishti apart from Gilgamesh. Uta-napishti's account does not make survival simple. The boat has protected life, yet the conditions of the world have been altered by the divine decision that made the boat necessary. Landing ends confinement, but it does not restore the past. This is one reason the offering carries such weight. It marks an attempt to stand again in relation to powers whose arguments and choices have shaped everything that came before. This is not a pattern that needs to be carried from story to story. Other flood narratives may use birds, or may not. They may imagine return, renewal, or preservation in entirely different ways. Within Tablet 11, the sequence belongs to Uta-napishti's own remembered ordeal. It is part of the explanation he gives Gilgamesh, not a rule for classifying the world's water stories. The exceptional fate of Uta-napishti and his wife makes that aftermath stranger. The couple are not simply returned to the ordinary human order after a difficult passage. They receive a life apart. For Gilgamesh, this must be both revealing and discouraging. The person he has sought is proof that the limit of death has been crossed somewhere in the epic's past. He is also proof that the crossing happened under conditions no traveler can arrange. The epic lets that lesson remain unsentimental. Survival has not made Uta-napishti a triumphant instructor with a reliable method for others. His isolation is part of what Gilgamesh encounters. He has lived beyond the usual measure, but this very difference keeps him distant from the man who comes seeking a cure for grief. The aftermath, then, has several quiet layers. A vessel has found rest. Birds have tested an uncertain world. An offering has been made. A survivor and his wife have received an altered fate. Each action leads away from the flood without making the flood a neat solution to the epic's deeper question. Gilgamesh remains mortal, and the account explains the exception without making it available. Another flood narrative will also move from destruction toward a new arrangement of the world. Its language and religious concerns are its own. The transition is worth making carefully, because a post-flood offering or a vessel on receding water can resemble a scene elsewhere without turning two texts into the same story told with different costumes. In Genesis, the flood is arranged around a different account of order, lost and restored. Chapters 6 through 9 begin with a world described as corrupt, move through the preservation of Noah and those carried in the ark, and continue until the waters withdraw and a covenant gives the ending its lasting shape. The story can be compared with Mesopotamian literature, but it should first be allowed to speak in its own literary and religious setting. Noah is given an ark, a vessel prepared not as a casual escape, but as a means of preservation. The narrative's concern is not only that some life should remain after the waters. It is concerned with a world whose proper arrangement has been overturned, then slowly established again. The flood moves through the story as a reversal. Things that had been separated and made habitable are covered over. Boundaries become uncertain. The familiar order of land and living creatures is suspended. David Kleins describes this imagery as uncreation. The word is useful because it catches the narrative movement without reducing it to a question of whether. Genesis recalls the ordered world of creation and imagines that order undone. The ark becomes a contained place where continuity is held while the larger scene is remade. It is not simply a boat in a storm. It is a space where the possibility of a renewed world is kept from disappearing. The waters eventually recede. This restoration is not rushed, and it does not erase what preceded it, as though the narrative had merely taken a long detour. Noah comes out into a changed moral order. The covenant that follows is central to the story's resolution. It includes the rainbow as its sign and the assurance that such a flood will not again be used in the same way. The image is quiet after the scale of the waters, a visible mark that turns the ending toward restraint rather than toward another cycle of destruction. That restraint gives Genesis a different final movement from Uta-napishti's exceptional immortality. The Mesopotamian survivor is set apart from ordinary humanity. Noah's story moves toward a commitment concerning the world and its future. Both narratives contain preservation and a post-flood order, but the nature of that order is not identical. One account is embedded in an epic of mortality. The other is shaped by corruption, judgment, restoration, and covenant. It is possible to notice ordered similarities without pretending they settle every larger question. Warning: a vessel, preservation, subsiding water, sacrifice, and a new arrangement after the flood can appear in more than one literary tradition. Such similarities are real features of the texts. They do not, by themselves, tell us exactly how Genesis was composed, how its relation to Mesopotamian writings should be understood, or what historical event anyone should place behind the narrative. The scope of Genesis's flood, its composition history, and its relationship to neighboring literature have all received extensive discussion. No single short conclusion can make those questions vanish. It is better to say that this text has its own structure and theological concerns, and that comparison must remain alert to both resemblance and difference. A borrowed-looking object in one story may do very different work in another. Within Genesis, the beginning of the flood is tied to a diagnosis of corruption. The narrative does not present water as an accidental interruption to an otherwise unchanged world. It places the waters inside an account of disorder that has reached into human life. That moral setting is part of why the retreat of the waters cannot be the whole ending. A restored earth requires a new arrangement and a stated limit. Kleins's word on creation helps with this movement because it points to the reversal of an ordered world. Habitable divisions are disturbed. Dry ground and the life that depends upon it are no longer secure in the same way. The imagery carries Genesis back toward creation without simply repeating it. The story imagines a world coming apart, then moving gradually toward habitable order again. The ark holds continuity within that reversal. Noah and those preserved with him are not presented as a random remnant carried by chance. Their preservation is ordered and purposeful within the narrative. The vessel protects the possibility that life can continue after the waters withdraw. It does not make the surrounding destruction easy, and it does not remove the theological seriousness of the story. It is a contained place of preservation, while the larger world passes through unmaking. The recession of the waters, therefore, has the pace of restoration rather than escape. The narrative takes time to move from enclosure to open ground. Its concern is not merely whether a person can survive a difficult passage. It is whether the world can receive life again under a changed relation between the divine and the human. The covenant answers that concern. The rainbow is not only an attractive image arriving after rain. Within the story, it is a sign attached to commitment about the future. The resolution turns away from repetition. The flood does not establish an endless cycle in which the world is repeatedly erased and restarted by the same means. It sets a boundary that becomes part of the narrative's moral order. This is why the final image has such quiet force. After a vast disruption, the sign is not another weapon, structure, or royal decree. It is a visible mark of restraint. The account directs attention toward continuity, obligation, and the future of the earth. Its ending is less interested in making Noah an exceptional figure separated from everyone else than in describing a renewed order in which life can go on. That distinction should not be blurred when Genesis is placed beside Mesopotamian writings. There are points at which stories can be set in conversation. There are also differences in frame, ending, and religious purpose that remain when familiar actions appear in both. A vessel may preserve life in more than one narrative without having the same meaning in each one. The text itself does not settle every modern question that readers bring to it. Its relationship to other ancient literature continues to be debated. So do questions about composition and scope. The responsible task is smaller and more attentive. To follow Genesis through its own movement from corruption, through preservation and receding water, toward a covenant that gives the ending its particular shape. For now, the ark has done its work inside Genesis. The waters have receded. The covenant has set a limit within the narrative's vision of the future. Before traveling to another shore of the ancient Mediterranean, there is one more task: to pause beside these apparent parallels and ask what a resemblance can honestly tell us. That question is less exciting than a grand answer, which is probably why it is useful. Flood narratives invite family trees. A warning appears. A vessel is built. Living things endure. Water falls. An offering is made, and a new order begins. It is easy to lay these scenes beside one another and imagine a single ancient original, with every later story fading outward from it like rings in a pond. The evidence does not move so obediently. Atra-hasis, the Mesopotamian survivor warned by Aya, belongs to a damaged and varied tablet tradition. Uta-napishti speaks within the epic of Gilgamesh, where the remembered flood explains why he is set apart from ordinary death. Genesis has its own sequence of uncreation, preservation, restoration, and covenant. Similar elements are worth noticing because they are there. Their presence is not a receipt proving precisely who borrowed from whom, or a map showing the route by which every image traveled. Literary relationship is often more complicated than direct copying. Stories can circulate, be reshaped, answer one another, draw from shared environments, or acquire similar solutions, because people facing imagined water must solve some similar narrative problems. A vessel is useful when a story requires survival across water. Birds are useful when the people inside cannot tell whether land has returned. A sacrifice can mark renewed relations between human beings and gods. These observations do not cancel comparison. They merely ask comparison to do its work without pretending it has become a verdict. David Kleins discusses Genesis in relation to Atra-hasis, but that discussion is not a conclusive demonstration of direct borrowing. A scholarly argument can illuminate a text without closing every question around it. This is true of ancient literature especially, where surviving copies are partial, transmission histories are long, and the original social setting of a story may be difficult to recover. Certainty has a way of arriving much faster than the tablets do, nor do similarities establish that a single worldwide flood lies behind all the accounts. The Mesopotamian texts, Genesis, and the traditions still to come were formed in different languages, settings, genres, and histories of preservation. To call them all imperfect memories of one event would make the comparison simple, but at the cost of making the stories less intelligible. It would turn a reed wall warning, an epic of death, and a covenant into loose pages from an imaginary report. The better approach is slower. First ask what a narrative says within its own world. Then notice what another narrative does differently with a related problem. A comparison remains useful when it preserves that difference. It becomes careless when it makes the distinctive parts look like accidental decoration around a shared plot. This caution leaves plenty of room for wonder. It is strange that water can so often become a way to imagine loss, remaking, divine displeasure, work, memory, or a dangerous coastline. The strangeness grows rather than shrinks when the stories are not forced into one ancestry. They can remain neighbors without being declared siblings. This does not mean that all comparisons are equally weak. It means that comparison has levels. At the closest level, a reader can describe scenes that appear in more than one text. At a further level, a reader can ask whether literary contact is likely. At the furthest level, a reader may try to reconstruct ancient pathways of tradition. Each step needs more evidence than the last. A resemblance is a starting point, not the final page of the inquiry. The Mesopotamian material itself resists being compressed into one fixed source. Atra-hasis comes through different surviving witnesses, while Uta-napishti's account is part of the epic of Gilgamesh and answers Gilgamesh's search for a life beyond death. Even before Genesis enters the comparison, the stories have different settings and literary work. Calling them all one tale would make the archive easier to sort, but would leave much of the literature unexplained. Genesis deserves the same care. Its movement through corruption, preservation, restoration, and covenant gives its flood narrative an internal shape. It cannot be reduced to a collection of objects borrowed from somewhere else, any more than the Mesopotamian stories can be reduced to early drafts of a later account. Texts can be related without becoming interchangeable. They can share material or motifs without surrendering their particular ends. The historical question has another limit. A narrative can name a city, describe a vessel, and preserve a sequence of actions without becoming a straightforward record of one physical event. Literary resemblance cannot turn several texts into coordinated evidence for a global flood. That conclusion asks the stories to do a kind of work they were not written to do, and it asks surviving sources to answer questions beyond what they securely preserve. It is more useful to notice the problems these narratives choose to solve. Receiving a warning when knowledge is withheld, preserving what matters when the familiar world has become unstable, and renewing an order after it has failed. These concerns recur in different forms because they are broad human concerns. Their recurrence does not erase the languages, religious settings, and transmission histories in which each answer was made. The slower method has a modest reward. It allows uncertainty to remain part of the story rather than an embarrassment pushed to the edge. The damaged tablet does not have to become a complete book. The epic does not have to become a field report. The covenant does not have to settle a scholarly genealogy. Each can be read for the work it performs before it is placed beside another text. Across the Mediterranean, one Greek account takes survival in another direction. Its central figures are not known for preserving a crowded vessel of animals. They are a married pair who reach a mountain and face the peculiar problem of making human beings again from an oracle's words. The Greek story begins with a pair rather than a hidden survivor and his private instruction. Atra-hasis records that Zeus decided to flood much of Greece. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, and his wife Pyrrha survive the waters in a chest, or larnax. The word can suggest a box or chest, and it gives their refuge a compact, almost domestic strangeness. This is not a ship crowded with the future of every species. It is a small enclosure carrying two people through a world that has lost its human company. Deucalion's connection with Prometheus gives the story an old Greek family setting before the water rises. Prometheus is the figure associated in Greek tradition with humanity and with a difficult relation to Zeus. Atra-hasis does not use that parentage as a simple explanation that makes every later detail obvious. It places Deucalion within a known mythic family, then lets the flood rearrange the world around him. Pyrrha travels with him. Her presence is essential because this story will not end with a lone survivor given an unusual fate. The couple must confront the absence of other people and discover how human life can begin again. Their shared survival is therefore not a quiet background fact. it prepares the unusual solution that follows. For 9 days and nights, according to Ap-a-lod-a-Rus, the chest is carried by the waters. Then it comes to Parnassus. A mountain landing is a useful image in a flood story, but here Parnassus belongs to the Greek narratives, particular geography, and sacred imagination. The pair do not arrive at a neutral patch of dry ground. They arrive at a place already heavy with Greek mythic associations. Ap-a-lod-a-Rus is the source that records this account for us. He should not be made into an independent historical chronicler standing beside a disaster with a notebook. His library gathers and arranges mythic material in literary form. That does not make the story worthless or disposable. It tells us what kind of evidence we are handling. The narrative is a Greek account of divine action, survival, and renewed humanity, preserved in an ancient literary record. That literary setting matters in quieter ways as well. The story gives names to the people who survive, places them in a divine family, gives their refuge a particular shape, and brings them to a named mountain. Each choice belongs to the account Ap-a-lod-a-Rus records. None requires the story to function as a list of facts waiting to be confirmed outside the page. A mythic story can be exact about its own persons and places, while asking a different kind of question from a chronicle. The scale is also deliberately limited by the wording of the account. Zeus floods much of Greece. That is an immense loss within the world of the tale, but it is not an invitation to extend the claim across every shore and every people. The Greek scene has its own god, its own couple, and its own mountain. Keeping those particulars in place allows the story to remain Greek rather than becoming one more item in a crowded inventory of supposedly identical deluges. There is an ordinary human problem inside the mythic scale. A chest is enough to keep Deucalion and Pyrrha together while water carries them, but it cannot by itself restore conversation, households, or the ordinary continuance of a human community. Their survival leaves them with no crowd to organize and no inherited routine to resume. The story makes that emptiness the condition of its next movement. It does not rush past it in order to celebrate the landing. Their position at Parnassus is therefore less a final refuge than a pause after endurance. The journey has ended, yet the future is not supplied with the dry ground. Deucalion and Pyrrha have reached a place where an answer may be sought, but they do not possess the answer. This makes their shared presence important. They are not a king returning to a surviving city, nor a solitary figure set outside ordinary human life. They are a husband and wife facing the same silence and the same need to decide what to do next. Ap-a-lod-a-Rus's account can be read slowly enough to notice that the flood is not its sole subject. The divine decision and the long drift establish the condition of loss. The later action asks what human renewal might require when the old population is gone. The answer will be strange, but the strangeness is not decorative. It shifts the story from escape to meaning. The couple must receive words, consider them, and recognize that a command may say more than its surface appears to say. The destruction itself need not occupy the center for long. Zeus floods much of Greece, and the pair outlast it. The more distinctive question appears after the water no longer carries them. What can two survivors do with an emptied world? Other stories preserve life already gathered in a vessel, or leave a survivor set apart. This one makes renewed humanity into an interpretive problem. Deucalion and Pyrrha do not simply begin a new settlement by ordinary means. They seek guidance. This choice shifts the story away from the voyage and toward a consultation with divine speech. The old world has been washed away. The new one cannot be made by confidence alone. A riddle waits where a practical instruction might have been expected. The scene also keeps its distance from any claim about a universal deluge. Atra-hasis says what he says about Greece, Zeus, the couple, the chest, and Parnassus. The record supports a Greek narrative with a particular aftermath. It does not ask to be turned into an archaeological report, a hidden copy of Mesopotamian literature, or a spare version of Genesis. Its oddness is exactly its value. The survivors reach land, and their real work begins only after the voyage is over. The guidance Deucalion and Pyrrha receive does not offer a census, a plan for houses, or a list of descendants. It arrives as an oracle, and the oracle has the dense, sideways quality that ancient divine speech often prefers. They are told to cast the bones of their mother behind them. For people who have just survived a flood and found the human world empty, this is not an instruction that becomes sensible at once. The pair understand their mother to be the earth. Her bones are stones. They take stones and throw them behind them. In Atra-hasis' account, the stones thrown by Deucalion become men, and those thrown by Pyrrha become women. Humanity returns not through an ark's preserved population, but through an act of interpretation. The couple must first understand what language is asking of them. Only then can they carry out the act that remakes the world. The oracle does not remove the couple's difficulty by speaking plainly. Its force comes from asking them to pause over a phrase that could be heard in more than one way. A mother may be a person, but it may also be the earth that carries and receives all people. Bones may be remains, but they may also be the hard stones scattered across that earth. The solution depends on allowing both meanings to stand together long enough for the command to become possible. That small interval of thought gives the scene its peculiar dignity. Deucalion and Pyrrha have survived because a chest kept them above the water. They help create the future because they do not treat divine speech as a blunt order. They listen, consider, and act together. The narrative makes understanding part of survival. A safe landing has not finished the work. It has only made a different kind of work possible. The stones also give the new humanity a material connection to the place where the couple stand. Nothing is fetched from a distant storehouse, and no hidden population appears after the flood has passed. The objects at hand become the means of beginning again. That makes the action feel both mythical and close to the ground. The pair bend, lift what lies nearby, and cast it behind them. A world returns through an act simple enough to describe in a few quiet motions. Atra-hasis does not ask the episode to explain population in the manner of an ordinary family history. The transformation supplies a mythic answer to an impossible question. How can two people stand at the beginning of a human world without merely waiting for descendants to multiply? The answer is Earth itself, understood through the oracle. The story's renewal is immediate in its own terms, but it remains dependent on a reading that the survivors have to make correctly. This is why the stones should not be treated as a curious flourish attached to the voyage. The chest carries the couple through the loss of the old human world. The oracle establishes how the new one begins. The two scenes belong together, but they do different work. One preserves a pair. The other turns that pair into interpreters, whose decision changes what the ground behind them can hold. There is a peculiar gentleness in the image. Stones are common, silent, and already part of the ground where the couple stand. The new people do not arrive from a distant, hidden place. They emerge from the earth underfoot after an oracle has taught the survivors how to read the ground as kin. Greek myth often allows language to make a bridge between literal and figurative meanings. Here, that bridge is the whole path forward. The story does not require a modern audience to believe that stones literally became people in order to notice what the scene is doing. It links human life to earth, endurance, and the ability to interpret divine riddles. It makes renewal less like recovery of property and more like a new beginning with materials that were there all along. Deucalion and Pyrrha are not merely spared. They become responsible for understanding what survival is for. The source remains a literary account, and its answer belongs to that account's mythic world. It does not provide a historical sequence from which a later population can be counted. Its value lies elsewhere. It preserves a Greek imagination of renewal in which human beings come from the ground. A divine message requires interpretation, and an emptied world is restored by a couple who can hear a riddle without mistaking it for nonsense. Ancient stories are not always eager to make their repair plans convenient. The aftermath settles once the riddle has been answered. The story has moved away from the water without pretending that the water itself supplied renewal. The essential change happens on land, in language, and in the stones that the pair choose to understand differently. That change leaves the Greek flood with an ending unlike the vessel-centered narratives that preceded it. That responsibility distinguishes the episode from the Greek couple's earlier journey. The chest has delivered them to Parnassus, but it cannot answer the question of repopulation. The answer comes through speech, and speech must be handled carefully. In this respect, the oracle resembles the reed wall warning in only the broadest way. Both make human action depend on indirect communication. Their worlds and purposes are different. The Greek scene is about the reading of a riddle after the waters have gone. It is also a reminder that familiar flood story labels can conceal more than they explain. Calling Deucalion on an ancient Noah or treating the stones as a decorative addition to an ark tale would reverse the story's emphasis. The chest matters, but the remaking matters more. The human world returns through a couple, an oracle, earth, and a word understood after thought. The image of a small, unexpected guide has another life far from Parnassus. In a South Asian tradition preserved in the Mutsya Purana, renewal begins with a fish and a man named Manu. The fish does not speak in an oracle's riddle. Its presence grows steadily more consequential until a private encounter has become a warning about dissolution and a future creation. The fish arrives as a small creature asking for care. Manu encounters it, and the encounter develops until the animal can no longer be treated as an ordinary fish in an ordinary container. The Mutsya Purana preserves a fish-centered version of this tradition, linking Manu to warning, a boat, seeds, and a renewed creation. Its narrative rhythm is different from the Greek oracle. The future does not emerge from stones thrown behind two survivors. It is announced by a living being whose size and significance refuse to remain small. Manu's name belongs to a figure connected with the human world and its renewal. The fish warns him before dissolution. This is not merely a local flood arriving at a city wall. It belongs within a larger South Asian pattern in which worlds undergo dissolution and creation begins again. Water is part of a cosmological rhythm, not simply a punishment that ends with one final promise that it will never recur. The fish's growth gives the episode a memorable shape. A creature first treated as vulnerable becomes a bearer of knowledge and power. The changing scale asks Manu to revise his understanding step by step. What seemed small has become impossible to ignore. Old narratives often put decisive truth in forms that begin at the edge of notice. Here the fish carries warning and the possibility of continuation. The movement from care to warning is important. Manu does not begin with a public proclamation or an already completed vessel. The tradition approaches the coming dissolution through an encounter with a living creature. Its increasing significance alters the terms of that encounter. What first calls for protection becomes the one that can speak of a future beyond the present world. The reversal is quiet but complete. Manu's attention to the small creature becomes the beginning of his preparation. This is not the story of a person simply receiving a command and carrying it out in isolation. The fish remains at the center of the relation. Its presence makes the warning particular to this tradition, even where boats and preservation may recall scenes elsewhere. A comparison that notices the boat but loses the fish has reduced the episode to furniture. The fish changes the scale, provides the warning, and joins the story's movement from a threatened world toward another creation. The seeds give that future a practical texture. They are compact enough to be carried and patient enough to wait. Their importance lies not in display, but in delay. A seed holds no field within it, yet it assumes a field may someday exist again. In this account, preservation therefore reaches beyond keeping a human life afloat. It keeps open the possibility of cultivation, growth, and a world that can begin to provide for itself after the waters have done their work. The boat has a similar restraint. It is not the final answer to dissolution. It is an interval in which what must continue is held over from one condition of the world to another. Manu's task is preparatory rather than triumphant. He carries forward what can be carried, while the larger rhythm of dissolution and renewed creation continues around him. The scene does not claim that one human effort masters the whole cycle. It gives Manu a role inside it. That cyclical frame changes the meaning of warning. In a story that moves through recurring dissolution and creation, a warning is not only an alarm about loss. It is also knowledge that a future order can follow. This does not make the approach of water insignificant. It makes the narrative's horizon wider than the preservation of the present arrangement. The boat and seeds are held for a world that has not yet taken shape. The episode should not be flattened into a South Asian counterpart of a Mesopotamian or biblical boat builder. It shares a boat and warning with some other narratives, but its central agent is the fish, and its setting is a cycle of dissolution and renewal. The similarities are not nothing. They are simply not enough to erase the difference between a divine council secret, a covenantal restoration, and a fish whose warning unfolds within a recurring cosmic order. The surviving text gives a route into this world without making every question easy. The Mutsya Purana is a Sanskrit text, and the accessible resource that anchors this account is a primary text edition. It supports careful narration of the Manufish tradition. It does not provide an archaeological scene in which a modern observer can watch the first telling take shape. Nor does it settle a single original date for every form of the story. The surviving Sanskrit witness is enough to establish a careful starting point, not a license to settle every question around the story. It permits this account of Manu, the fish, the boat, the seeds, and renewed creation. It does not turn the narrative into an excavation report, and it does not make the date of a digital edition the date of the tradition. Those are different kinds of evidence with different histories behind them. Within the story, however, the sequence has a clear emotional pressure. The creature that required care has made preparation necessary. The seeds that can seem so slight carry the burden of future growth. Manu is not asked to preserve a finished world. He is asked to keep a beginning available while the cycle passes through dissolution. The boat is a place of waiting, but the waiting has a purpose beyond mere endurance. Within the narrative itself, however, the important pressure is clear. Manu must prepare before dissolution arrives. He is asked to carry forward what can grow again. The boat and seeds make preservation a patient responsibility rather than a triumph over the waters. The coming renewal has been announced, but it remains in the future, enclosed in a vessel and in the small, durable promise of seed. That promise draws the story toward a further question. What kind of witness do we have when a tale survives in Sanskrit text, in editions, and in long traditions of reading? The answer does not remove Manu from his cyclical world. It helps keep modern certainty from claiming more than the surviving text can bear. The preserved seeds point forward, but the text that carries their story also points backward through its own history. A digital Sanskrit edition of the Quiche Popol Vuh makes the text available and identifies the edition it presents. That is valuable evidence. It gives readers access to a primary textual resource and grounds the claim that a Manu and fish flood tradition exists in this Purana. It does not do every other kind of work a researcher might wish for. A digital Sanskrit text is not an excavation report. It cannot establish the exact date at which the story first took its surviving form. The first moment when Manu encountered the fish in oral performance, or the complete meaning of every term in every historical setting. Texts move through copying, editing, recitation, commentary, and translation. Their survival is a long passage, not a single clear window. This limitation is not an excuse to say nothing. It gives the narration a proper scale. The Quiche Popol Vuh preserves a tradition in which dissolution, preservation, and renewed creation are connected. It lets us speak of Manu, the fish, the boat, and the seeds with care. It does not require us to assign a neat ancient date to every layer of the account, simply because a modern edition has made the text easier to consult. An edition is a meeting place between a surviving text and a present-day audience. It makes particular words available in a particular arrangement, and it identifies the scholarly edition on which that presentation rests. That is a considerable service. It is not the same as recovering every earlier manuscript, every performance, or interpretation through which the story may have passed. The route to a readable text is part of its history, but it is not the whole history of the tradition. This distinction keeps several tempting shortcuts apart. The existence of a Sanskrit text does not automatically provide a date for the first version of a story. A text's presence in a digital archive does not turn its cosmological events into physical evidence, nor does the absence of a single neat origin make the narrative vague or unworthy of attention. The source allows some statements with confidence and leaves others properly open. That is the ordinary condition of old literature, however much a tidy timeline may object. The story's cyclical setting also deserves to remain visible at the level of form. A cycle is not merely a straight chronology with more than one event placed upon it. It gives beginning and ending a different relation. Dissolution prepares the conditions in which renewal can be imagined, and preservation holds what may be needed when that renewal arrives. The fish boat, and seeds belong to that pattern. Their meaning changes if they are pulled out and treated only as clues to a single event on a modern calendar. Careful limits can therefore make the tradition more, not less, legible. They keep the surviving resource from being asked to perform the work of geology, archaeology, and an unbroken record of oral transmission all at once. They also keep a modern desire for exact origins from flattening a story whose own time is patterned by recurrence. The source is not silent. It simply speaks most clearly about the tradition it preserves. Cycles of dissolution and renewal also resist the desire for one final historical explanation. In a cyclical setting, an ending may contain the conditions of another beginning. The water story is not necessarily a memory that seeks a single date on a timeline. It can be part of a much wider account of recurring creation. To turn it into a disguised record of one known disaster would make it simpler, but would leave out the cosmological work the story is doing. There is a modest lesson in the fish itself. It grows beyond the container first provided for it. Evidence can do something similar. A source begins as a useful answer, then becomes too large for the question placed around it. The primary text is enough to establish some things, but not enough to settle every claim about origin, language, history, or geology. The most careful response is not to shrink the source into a slogan. There is no need to dismiss either the manuscript tradition or the modern edition in order to observe these limits. The available text is the reason this strand of the Manu story can be discussed at all. Respect for it means distinguishing the claims it supports from the claims brought to it from elsewhere. A flood narrative can carry philosophical and religious work without serving as an anonymous report from an ancient riverbank. This sort of patience becomes especially necessary when a traditional flood account appears beside a dramatic physical event. In China, the central action in early great flood narratives is not an enclosed survivor waiting for water to fall. It is sustained work on water itself. A later modern study of a gorge will offer a date and an enormous outburst flood. Before that argument appears, the older story needs room to show its own scale. Rivers, channels, labor, and the long effort to make a world navigable. In the Chinese Great Flood tradition, the most important answer to dangerous water is not departure. It is work. The stories associated with Goon and Yu turn toward riverbeds, channels, and the difficult business of making water move through an ordered world. That shift changes the entire feeling of the narrative. There is no central enclosed refuge carrying a small future across a blank sea. There is a landscape that must be understood, opened, and reshaped over time. Goon is associated with the earlier struggle against the flood. The tradition then centers Yu, whose response becomes the better-known one. Sarah Allen emphasizes that early accounts present Yu as opening riverbeds across the world. The phrase matters because it gives the story a broad but practical imagination. Yu is not simply a hero who defeats water in one gesture. he is connected with a prolonged ordering of channels. The contrast between Gun and Yu gives the tradition a sense of work that must be learned rather than merely declared. Gun is associated with the earlier problem, while Yu is the figure whose labor comes to define the solution in the early accounts discussed by Allen. The narrative does not need to make this into a neat tale of one person's error and another's perfection. Its durable image is the shift toward channels and riverbeds, toward finding ways for water to move rather than imagining that it can simply be kept still. Opening riverbeds across the world is a large action, but it is not vague. A riverbed gives water a course. A channel distinguishes movement from spreading. The work imagined for you, therefore, proceeds through places where water must be guided, cleared, or allowed passage. It is a story of ordered ground as much as of water. The flood's answer lies in the relation between the two. That relation gives the great flood tradition an unusual tempo. A vessel story gathers its attention around a confined space and a period of waiting. Yu's work distributes attention across waterways. It implies continued labor over distance, where one course of water affects another, and an ordered world depends on passages remaining open. The emphasis is not on a single survivor carried beyond danger. It is on the difficult making of conditions in which many people may live with rivers. This makes the later dynastic association especially understandable, even though it must not be placed too early. A figure who brings waters into ordered courses is easy for later memory to connect with the beginning of political order. Yet Allen's caution remains necessary. The familiar link between the flood and the Xi-Ah dynasty is absent from the earliest accounts. A later connection can be powerful without being the starting point of the tradition. The distinction is not a minor note for specialists to keep in a drawer. It changes the story's shape. If Yu's earliest role is treated as a founder of Xi-Ah from the beginning, water control can appear as a ready-made dynastic origin story. If the earlier accounts are allowed their own terms, the central action is broader. Riverbeds opened across an ordered world. The political association belongs to a later layer, not to every version at once. The work has an almost administrative patience. Water cannot be persuaded by speeches alone. It has to be given courses, beds, and outlets. A story about river control can hold a great deal of human experience, observation, travel, labor, failure, and the knowledge that one blocked place may alter another far away. The great flood in this frame is not only a terror to outlast, it is a problem of relation between people, earth, and moving water. That does not turn you into a modern engineer with a clipboard and a timetable. He belongs to early Chinese tradition with its own mythic and political meanings. But the action assigned to him is distinctive. It is sustained rather than sudden. The world becomes habitable through opening riverbeds, not through a single vessel's survival. Later accounts often connect Yu's flood work with the foundation of the Xi-Ah dynasty. Allen cautions that this familiar association does not appear in the earliest accounts. That is an important distinction. A later dynastic memory can place a water control figure at the beginning of a political order, without proving that the same connection organized the oldest available narratives. Traditions change their emphasis as they are retold, written, and used to explain authority. The absence of an early flood-to-sea link does not make later tradition meaningless. It tells us to keep layers visible. Use river work belongs to one level of the story. A later association with dynastic foundation belongs to another. Modern efforts to locate a physical event behind the tradition form yet another level. When these are stacked together too quickly, a complex history becomes a single clean line, which is flattering to a diagram and unfair to the evidence. Keeping those layers visible also makes room for the story's own scale. Use labor is not reduced to a technical footnote before a modern date enters the discussion. It remains an account of a world made habitable through waterways, one in which human order depends on an enduring accommodation with moving water. That is a different imaginative task from escape, and it cannot be measured solely by asking which physical flood might stand behind it. The figure of you, therefore, stays close to the channels. He is not a name waiting to be attached to a discovered disaster, and he is not a blank ancestor for a later dynasty alone. In the early tradition, as Allen describes it, he is the person whose labor opens riverbeds across the world. That action has enough narrative weight without borrowing certainty from a gorge or a calendar. For the moment, Yu remains in the narrative as a figure of water control. His achievement is a landscape where channels have been made to carry what once spread without order. The image is quieter than a boat on open water, though no less ambitious. It replaces rescue with maintenance, and it leaves behind a question that will return in later memory. When did this labor become the beginning of a dynasty? A modern geological proposal will seem to offer an answer in a gorge, a landslide dam, and a date. It is an intriguing argument. It must enter as a separate kind of evidence, not as the moment when a scientist finally finds the exact riverbed of Yu's story. The proposal begins at Shi Gorge, where Qing Long Wu and colleagues reported evidence for a very large outburst flood. Their reconstruction concerns an earthquake-triggered landslide dam failure, dated by their evidence to around 1920, before the Common Era. A dam of rock had blocked the river. Its failure released water on an exceptional scale. This is landscape science, built from physical traces, and an argument about what those traces record. Wu and colleagues proposed that the event could provide a historical context for the Chinese Great Flood tradition and for a revised early Shi chronology. The possibility has an immediate narrative appeal. An ancient account of overwhelming water and a dated physical flood seem to approach each other across a long distance. It is precisely the kind of meeting that can make a complicated question feel suddenly solved. The evidence assembled at the gorge has its own force before it is placed beside any traditional account. Wu and colleagues describe an earthquake, a landslide dam, and the release of water after that dam failed. Their proposed date and reconstruction concern a particular physical sequence in a particular setting. This is already a substantial historical question. It does not need a mythic name in order to be real or important. The difficulty begins when the physical sequence is asked to answer a literary one. A very large flood can seem to offer an obvious key to a great flood tradition, especially when later history supplies an attractive dynastic frame. Yet resemblance in scale or subject does not erase the difference between a reconstructed outburst and an early narrative of waterways ordered across the world. The two accounts are not formed from the same kind of evidence, and they are not necessarily trying to preserve the same thing. But a proposal of correlation is not an identification. Sarah Allen does not deny that an outburst flood occurred at Quiche Gorge. Her objection concerns the attempt to make that event into Yu's flood and to attach it directly to early Shi-Ah history. In her reading, the early Yu narrative is not a narrow account of one flood at one location. It describes an ordered world of waterways and riverbeds. The familiar connection between flood control and Shi-Ah develops later than the earliest accounts. Allen's response gives the literary tradition a chronology of its own. The later association of flood control with Shi-Ah may explain why a dated flood and a dynastic starting point appear to fit together so readily. But an association that develops later cannot simply be carried back into the earliest narratives without argument. Her concern is not that water science has nothing to say. It is that a geological event and a changing textual tradition must be allowed to remain different objects of study. This leaves a more interesting, if less tidy, picture. The gorge study can invite questions about the environmental history of the region and the scale of ancient flooding. The early Yu narrative can be read for its account of riverbeds, channels, and the ordered world made by water control work. Later dynastic memory can be studied as a further development. These may illuminate one another, but illumination is not the same as collapsing them into one event with one unquestioned meaning. Both sides of the discussion are useful because they ask different questions. The geological study asks what happened in a particular place and when. The textual study asks what early narratives say, how their world is imagined, and when later political associations enter the record. Neither question can simply consume the other. A gorge can preserve evidence of water moving with extraordinary force. A story can preserve an account of order made through channels. The resemblance between them is an invitation to investigate, not a command to declare them identical. This is also a good place to remember how easily the word proof becomes too large. Archaeology has not found Yu's flood in the sense of locating a single literary episode beneath sediment. The Jishi evidence does not prove the Shi-Ah dynasty. It gives Wu and colleagues grounds for specific historical proposal. Allen's response asks that the early tradition's broader logic and the later growth of dynastic association remain in view. The unresolved argument is not a disappointing ending. It is the real historical situation. Different kinds of evidence meet, overlap, and resist one another. A physical flood may be very real without becoming the source of every story later told about water. A traditional narrative may be culturally consequential without being reducible to a dated event. The work of comparison is to hold both statements at once. That restraint is especially useful in a history of flood traditions. A date can feel wonderfully solid. A named gorge, a reconstructed dam, and physical traces on a landscape can feel like an answer that no longer needs interpretation. But even the strongest physical reconstruction answers its own question before it answers anyone else's. It describes an event and proposes a correlation. The proposal remains open to discussion beside the different scale and logic of the early textual account. From this debate, a different flood story can enter without any pressure to find its date in a gorge. In the Quiche Popol Vuh, water belongs to a sequence of creation attempts. Its central question is not which survivor can be matched to an ancient disaster. It is what happens when beings made from wood fail in their relation to the makers who formed them. The Popol Vuh begins this part of its story before the flood, with an attempt to make beings who can speak, remember, and offer praise to their makers. The beings in question are made of wood. In Alan J. Christensen's translation of the Quiche text, they have shape and movement, but they fail in the relation expected of them. They do not properly acknowledge those who made them. The problem is not that a historical society has committed an error that must be explained by a disaster. It belongs to a sequence of creation, failure, and another attempt. This setting changes the meaning of the water. The flood is not organized around an ark, a selected navigator, or a covenant after survival. It is one part of the removal of an earlier creation. To call the episode a Maya version of Noah would make it immediately familiar, but only by discarding the work the narrative is doing. The wooden beings are not a population selected for rescue. They are an unsuccessful form of humanity within a Quiche creation story. The text's Quiche setting should remain in view for the same reason. It is not a blank example placed beside Mediterranean or Mesopotamian material. It is a narrative with its own language of makers, created beings, memory, and response. The flood enters that narrative as one element in a transition. Its presence makes a comparison possible, but the surrounding creation sequence determines what the presence means. Their failure is described in terms of speech, memory, and offering. Such language is easily mishandled if it is treated as a simple moral judgment on real communities. It belongs to the narrative's account of what a proper created being should be able to do. The story imagines makers seeking beings capable of relation, recognition, and response. The wooden figures do not fulfill that purpose, and the creation sequence moves on. There is no need to extract a modern verdict from that failure. The narrative does not require listeners to judge actual people who lived in the past or people who live now by the measure applied to its wooden figures. Its concern is internal and mythic. One attempt does not achieve the relation for which it was made. When the account moves on, it does so because the work of creation has not reached its intended form. This internal logic also makes the episode quieter than a simple story of punishment. Something unfinished is set aside so that another attempt can follow. The movement has gravity, but it need not be made harsh. The wooden people occupy a place in the account's long thinking about how a world should be inhabited. Their passing marks a change in that thought, not an invitation to dwell on harm. This is why the flood should not be allowed to monopolize the scene. Water is present, but it is joined by other forces in the episode. The text's concern is a failed creation and the transition toward a different one. A flood tale can therefore have no central survivor at all. It can be about the ending of one kind of creature rather than the preservation of another. That absence of a central rescuer is especially important after so many narratives in which preparation has occupied the foreground. Here, the account does not linger over the planning of an escape or the storage of a future world. It directs attention elsewhere, to the condition of the beings already made, and to the possibility that a beginning can be revised. The waters are consequential, but they are not the sole organizing image. The larger sequence gives the episode a measured, almost procedural quality. An attempt is made. Its limits become clear. The account passes toward another beginning. That movement is strange precisely because it refuses an easy human center. The reader is asked to consider creation from the perspective of its makers, and then to accept that the first available form of humanity will not remain. The wooden beings are also associated in the account with monkeys as survivors or descendants. The association is part of the story's strange aftermath, not a biological explanation or a joke placed at the end to lighten a grim scene. In a narrative of successive creation, beings and animals may carry relations that do not fit modern categories. The point is to remain with the text's own imaginative order rather than translating it too quickly into familiar terms. The association asks for the same patience as the earlier creation scenes. It does not offer a scientific account of animal origins, nor does it close the episode with a tidy solution. Instead, it leaves a trace of the wooden people within the story's later imaginative landscape. A listener can notice that trace without forcing it to answer questions the passage does not ask. This is one reason the Popol Vuh cannot be compressed into a single plot word. Flood is one such word, and creation is another, but neither alone contains the movement from wooden beings to their aftermath. The account connects making, relation, failure, removal, and what remains. Its unusual turns are not obstacles to comparison. They are the reasons comparison must begin with close attention. Christensen's translation offers an accessible path into the Popol Vuh, but the path should not make the Quiche setting disappear. The text carries pre-colonial traditions through a later manuscript and translation history. Its availability in a modern book or digital file is not the same as an unbroken recording of an ancient voice. That history will matter shortly. First, the internal sequence needs to remain clear. Makers have tried to form beings. Wooden people have failed to remember and praise them, and their removal is about to be described. The internal order is the safest guide. Before there is any attempt to compare this flood with another, there are makers and the beings they have made. Before there is a question of survival, there is a failure of memory and praise. The account asks the listener to remain there long enough to understand why the next movement happens at all. The calmest way to tell that removal is also the most faithful. There is no need to turn it into a spectacle of punishment. The narrative moves through flood, resin rain, and other animate forces, then beyond the wooden creation. Its energy lies not in damage lingered over, but in the unsettling thought that a world can be made, found wanting, and set aside before the next beginning has been permitted to appear. The removal comes in several forms. The Popol Vuh includes a flood and resin rain among the forces that end the wooden creation. Other animate agents join the sequence. The details are unusual enough that they should be stated without embellishment. The narrative does not ask to be transformed into a long scene of terror. It is a creation account moving away from a form of life that has failed its purpose. The order of attention matters here. The account has already established why the wooden people cannot remain within its creation sequence. The forces that follow are not an independent disaster story inserted between two unrelated scenes. They belong to that established movement away from an unsuccessful attempt. Naming flood and resin rain is enough to recognize the text's distinctive imagery. There is no gain in stretching those images into a spectacle. The restraint also makes room for what follows. A story of successive creation has to pass from one form to another, and this passage is difficult precisely because it is not gentle. Yet the narration can acknowledge that difficulty without lingering on fear. The wooden creation recedes from the account. The next possibility of creation waits beyond it. Water here is not a vessel-bearing expanse that waits to reveal dry land. It is one force in a larger unmaking. Resin rain gives the episode a texture unlike the stories of boats, mountain landings, and controlled rivers. The unfamiliar texture is useful. It stops comparison from becoming automatic. Even where flood appears, the meaning of flood changes with the creation story that contains it. Resin rain is a particularly clear sign that this episode should not be made too familiar. It does not fit comfortably into a ready-made catalog of arcs and landfalls. Its strangeness slows the listener down. instead of asking which known story it resembles. One can ask what role it has within this Quiche account of a world being remade. The text that gives us this sequence reaches modern readers through a particular history. The accessible Popol Vuh has a colonial-era transcription and a history of translation. At the same time, the narrative carries pre-colonial Quiche traditions. Both facts need to remain together. To notice the manuscript root is not to deny the depth of the traditions it records. To speak only of ancient origins without the root through which the text survived would make the document seem to have arrived without scribes, languages, or colonial history. This does not make the text fragile or less worthy of attention. It gives attention a more exact shape. A modern reader meets a translation, and through it, a colonial-era transcription, while the narrative itself carries pre-colonial traditions. Each part of that statement places a limit on certainty, but none reduces the story to a mere artifact of the moment it was written down. Such care is not merely academic housekeeping. A source's path affects what can be said about it. A manuscript gives a form to a narrative. A translation makes that form available in another language, while also requiring choices about words and meanings. Readers encounter the Popol Vuh through these layers, not by standing outside time and listening at the first telling. The same is true, in different ways, of tablets, Sanskrit texts, and the records of oral traditions. That history should not become a reason to step away from the story altogether. It is a reason to describe the story with care. We can say what Christensen's translation presents in this sequence. We can say that the text carries pre-colonial Quiche traditions through a colonial-era transcription and translation history. Beyond that, it is better not to invent a smooth, uninterrupted route from an imagined first telling to the page before us. The wooden people should not be made to carry more than the story gives them. Their failure has been named. Their association with monkeys belongs to the aftermath. The flood and resin rain have passed through the creation sequence. Nothing in this episode establishes that historical Maya society was destroyed by water, and nothing requires it to become a conventional rescue story. It is a Quiche account with its own answers to what creation demands of created beings. The wider term Maya can be useful for locating the Popol Vuh in a broad cultural field, but it should not flatten the Quiche character of the account. The source at hand names a particular tradition and a particular story world. Keeping that specificity does not prevent comparison. It prevents comparison from taking the place of understanding. Nor does the account need a historical catastrophe hidden behind it in order to matter. Its flood is meaningful within a sequence of creation and relation. The questions it raises concern memory, acknowledgement, and the possibility of beginning again after an earlier form has been set aside. Those questions are already substantial. They do not require an external event to validate them. There is a quieter consequence to following its manuscript history. The narrative becomes less like an item in a worldwide catalog and more like a text with a home, a language, and a route of preservation. It can still be compared with other accounts, but it cannot be detached from those conditions and filed under a broad label, as though labels were harmless. This is a useful pause before leaving the Popol Vuh. The manuscript route does not solve every question about the narrative, but it changes the manner in which those questions are asked. Instead of treating the episode as a loose motif, the listener can recognize a text whose present form has been preserved and translated under particular historical conditions. That recognition is part of listening well. Another record will soon make this source history equally visible. It is a Hawaiian sea rise tradition preserved in a later manuscript account. Its waters rise toward a named mountain and then recede. The story remains local in scale and in setting, even while it joins the long company of narratives in which a changed sea asks people to imagine how a familiar world might briefly become unrecognizable. In the Hawaiian account, called Ke Kai Akahineli, the sea rises toward Mauna Kea. The name of the mountain matters. It fixes the story in a known island world rather than leaving it on an abstract map of deluges. The University of Hawaii at Hilo record identifies the account as a Hawaiian deluge tradition, and the available version is attributed to a manuscript by David Malo. That measured change is one reason the scene remains memorable. A distant, abstract flood has no familiar edge. A sea moving toward a named mountain does. The account sets an altered waterline against a landscape that listeners can imagine as known and inhabited. It lets the scale of the event be felt through place, rather than through a numerical claim. The narrative tells of a family's search, after which the ocean rises as far as Mauna Kea before it recedes. The sequence has the unsettling simplicity of a familiar geography altered beyond its usual scale. A mountain remains a mountain, but the sea has moved into a relation with it that ordinary life does not expect. When the waters fall again, the story leaves its listeners with the memory of that relation. The family's search gives the movement of water a human beginning without making one individual into a universal flood hero. The account does not need to be supplied with a vessel, a list of animals, or a final covenant in order to resemble another narrative. Its action remains attached to a family and an island landscape. The rising and the recession are enough to make the ordinary order of sea and mountain briefly unfamiliar. When the water returns to its expected boundary, the story does not erase what has happened. The mountain is still there, but it has become the measure of an imagined sea rise. This is one way traditional narrative can keep a landscape in view, not by converting it into a background, but by making its features part of what the account remembers. It would be easy to turn this into a broad claim about islands and ancient catastrophe. That would be too quick. The record supports a particular Hawaiian tradition in a particular manuscript history. It does not prove that every island story remembers one event, and it does not ask the name of Mauna Kea to become a decorative stop in a tour of supposedly identical myths. Locality is not a small detail added after the main story. It is the condition that gives this account its meaning. An island setting can tempt an outsider to supply a general explanation before attending to the source. Seas change, coasts are exposed to danger, and mountains offer visible points of reference. Those broad observations may be true, but they do not tell this story. The account's own named geography and its documented record are more important than an argument that every island narrative must preserve the same memory. The association with David Malo's manuscript also deserves the same careful attention given to the Popol Vuh's transmission. A later written record preserves the form available to us. That record has its own history. It is not a date for the beginning of every telling, nor a reason to treat the tradition as a modern invention. It is the documentary route through which this version can be named and read. This is a modest claim, but it matters. A manuscript attribution identifies how a version has reached a library record. It does not provide a simple clock for the age of a tradition, and it does not grant permission to speak, as though a single written form contains every Hawaiian telling. The available source can be named honestly without turning its documentary path into an account of all possible transmission. The difference is especially important when stories are collected from living cultural settings. A written record can be invaluable while still being one record. It gives a reader a point of contact with a tradition, not ownership over the tradition or a complete map of its meanings. Careful narration stays with what the record supports and lets the Hawaiian setting remain primary. The seas rise and retreat do not need a modern geological explanation added from outside the source. Island communities have long known that water can be both a root and a danger, a provider and a boundary that does not always stay where people wish it would. The narrative's power comes from this local scale of danger and return. It does not need a universal theory placed over it. There is a calm dignity in allowing the source to keep its own scale. The listener can notice the disquiet of a sea moving where it is not expected, then the relief of its withdrawal, without turning either movement into a prediction or a lesson in hazard response. The account remembers an altered world for a time. It does not ask the present to be alarmed by it, nor need the story be isolated from the realities of an island world to be taken seriously. Water may be a path between places, a source of sustenance, and a force that changes what land looks like. Those are broad conditions of life near the sea. Kekai Akahi Nali gives them a particular narrative form with a particular mountain and a particular remembered rise. The water recedes and the mountain remains in its own place. That quiet ending makes room for another account of a world after flood, this time in an Anish, Ainabe, and Ojibwe context. There, the central problem is not how high the sea climbed. It is where new land can be made, and how animals become partners in the work presented by the Kiwi-na Bay Indian community from the Mishu book. Wainabu survives with animals. The story belongs in an Anish, Ainabe, and Ojibwe context, and its renewal does not depend on one human figure commanding a passive collection of creatures. It depends on reciprocal help, willingness, and the difficult work of recovering Earth. The first image is therefore not a completed world, but a shared problem. Water has withdrawn enough for the question to be felt, yet there is no ground ready for ordinary life. Wainabu is not alone with an answer already prepared. The animals are present as participants, and the possibility of a new Earth depends on what they can offer one another. This changes the pace of the story. Rather than moving directly from survival to settlement, it pauses over the work between them. Renewal must be made. The effort is collective, and the account asks the listener to see animals not as cargo or ornament, but as beings whose choices and capacities matter to the future of the world. Wainabu is aided by the animals after the flood. The group faces a practical and profound problem. If water covers the world, where can ground come from? The answer begins not with a vessel or a decree, but with attempts by animals to dive and bring up Earth. The work is shared, and its costs are not shared evenly. The question of ground gives the account a quiet clarity. A world cannot simply be announced into readiness when there is nowhere to place a foot. The animals' attempts turn a vast condition into a small, urgent task. Find Earth beneath the water and bring some of it back. The task is simple to state, but the story gives it moral weight because all the beings depend on its outcome. Muskrat succeeds in bringing up Earth at the cost of his life. The detail should be spoken plainly and not prolonged. What matters in the story is the gift of the small amount of Earth recovered through sacrifice. It is not much in size, but it is enough to become the beginning of a world. A thing that appears slight can carry an immense obligation when there is nothing else beneath the water. Muskrat's act gives the new Earth an origin in care rather than possession. The small amount recovered is not a treasure claimed by one survivor. It is material entrusted to the group because the group needs it. The account lets a modest handful carry the beginning of a world, and so redirects attention away from grandeur toward responsibility. The cost of the act should remain present without being made graphic. The story honors a being whose effort makes renewal possible. It asks the listener to recognize that a new beginning may rest on a gift that cannot be measured by size alone. In this sense, the Earth is precious before it has even become land. Turtle offers his back. The Earth is placed there, and new land begins. This image is often called Turtle Island in broader discussion, but the account should not be hurried away from its own named figures and community setting. Turtles offered back is not scenery. It is an act of support that makes renewal possible. The new Earth rests on relationship rather than on a solitary survivor's victory. Turtle's offer completes the work without making it private. Muskrat brings up the Earth and turtle provides the place where it can rest and grow. The actions answer one another. Neither can become the whole story by itself. The new land appears through a chain of assistance, in which every participant changes what the next participant can do. The image is steady rather than triumphant. A back becomes a foundation. A small amount of earth becomes the beginning of ground. The account does not need a grand monument to mark renewal. It gives renewal a living support. That support makes the world newly dependent on the relations that created it. The story's ethical shape is therefore distinct. Wei na bu shu, muskrat, and turtle do not form a collection of interchangeable flood motifs. Each action matters because it demonstrates responsibility among beings who need one another. The account can be deeply meaningful without being recast as a version of Genesis. Its concern is not a covenant marked in the sky or a preserved ark population. It is the making of earth through animals' participation and care. The Unish, Ainabe, and Ojibwe context is not an optional note placed outside the narration. It is the setting in which the named figures and their obligations belong. Keeping the setting visible prevents the story from becoming a loose illustration of a theory about flood motifs. It remains a recorded account of renewal among particular beings. The Kiwi Na Bay Indian community presentation gives this account a documented source, and the source should be credited in the narration's manner of attention. It does not authorize a claim about what every Unish, Ainabe, or Ojibwe person believes now. It anchors the telling in a specific published presentation of the Mishu book. The difference is respectful as well as accurate. A living community is not exhausted by one document, and a document is not a license to detach a story from its people. This boundary does not weaken the telling. It gives the telling a clear ground. The presentation identifies a route by which the account can be encountered, and it names the community context that should remain attached to it. A source is not only a storehouse of scenes, it also marks who has presented the story and the terms under which a reader has received it. There is a wider lesson in that modest act of attribution. Comparative listening becomes more careful when it does not imagine that every story is freely available for extraction. The account can be heard for its image of new earth and mutual aid, while its Unish, Ainabe, and Ojibwe setting remains part of every sentence said about it. After the flood, the image settles into work rather than spectacle. A small amount of earth, a broad back, and a shared task become enough to begin again. This is a lower, steadier kind of ending. It leaves the water present in memory, but turns attention toward what beings do for one another once the water has withdrawn. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, other recorded indigenous traditions remember water through canoes, sinking land, and sea-driven loss. They too have been placed beside modern hazard science. The records require the same restraint. Their local meanings cannot be replaced by the modern desire to identify one exact event behind every remembered wave. the Pacific Northwest, accounts gathered in Oregon State University's educational compilation do not speak with one single voice. They are recorded traditions from distinct indigenous contexts, involving flood, sinking land, canoes, and destruction driven by the sea. To place them together as a group is already a broad move. The narration needs to keep that breadth visible, rather than pretending there is one uniform Pacific Northwest flood story waiting to be summarized. Beginning with that limit makes the rest of the section more attentive. We can notice recurring images without declaring them identical. We can recognize that flood, changing ground, and travel on water have entered several remembered accounts. But a resemblance in imagery is not permission to combine the accounts into one story with one speaker and one meaning. Some accounts tell of water arriving from the sea. Some include land changing or sinking. Canoes appear as the ordinary technology of coastal life, and in circumstances of danger, as a means of movement across changed water. These images are rooted in coasts where the sea has always been both root and threat. They do not need to be turned into a modern emergency lesson to show that people who live with the Pacific have long understood its power. A canoe in such an account is not necessarily a symbol waiting to be translated into some universal language. It belongs first to coastal life, to travel, and to the knowledge that movement over water has its own demands. When conditions change, the same familiar means of travel may appear within a story of loss or escape. The image remains local even when a distant listener recognizes its emotional force. So too with sinking or altered land. Ground is usually the fixed part of a landscape, the place against which water is measured. When a tradition remembers that relation changing, it speaks from a world in which shore and sea cannot always be assumed to remain as they were. The image needs no added detail to carry that disturbance. Its power lies in the reversal of what ordinarily feels dependable. Researchers have compared certain recorded traditions with evidence for earthquakes and tsunamis, including discussion of the event associated with Cascadia in 1700. This comparison can be illuminating when it asks careful questions about what oral accounts preserve, what geological records show, and where the two may be placed beside one another. It becomes careless when it converts every narrative detail into eyewitness proof, or declares that all the accounts describe the same wave on the same day. The date belongs to a modern historical and scientific discussion. It is not a replacement title for the traditions themselves. Researchers may ask whether some accounts preserve memories that can be considered alongside evidence of a great earthquake and tsunami. That is a serious question, but it remains a question of correlation, interpretation, and evidence types, rather than an answer already contained in every recorded narrative. Careful comparison leaves room for partial correspondence and for uncertainty. A tradition may have its own purposes beyond preserving an event description. Geological evidence may establish that a physical process occurred without supplying the language through which communities understood it. Placing the two beside one another can be fruitful precisely when neither is asked to become a simple translation of the other. The distinction resembles the one at G. Sher Gorge, though the sources and communities are entirely different. Physical evidence and remembered narrative may meet without becoming identical. A tsunami deposit does not automatically translate a story word for word. A recorded story does not become less important because it cannot be pinned to a single date. Both have histories, and the relation between them is an object of inquiry rather than a prize waiting to be awarded. This restraint protects more than scholarly accuracy. It allows a story to retain meanings that do not depend on verification by a deposit, a date, or an instrument. A recorded account may speak about relations to place, the memory of danger, or the responsibilities of life by the sea. Those meanings are not a lesser form of evidence because they do not answer every question a geologist might ask. The compilation is a secondary educational source. That fact sets a boundary around what it can carry. It can support a cautious account of the recorded traditions and of researchers' comparisons. It should not be made to speak for all Pacific Northwest indigenous communities, nor should it erase the collectors, translators, and institutional pathways through which the material reached an educational publication. An educational compilation performs useful work by bringing materials into view, but its frame is still a frame. It selects, summarizes, and presents. That makes it a responsible starting point for the limited claims made here, not a warrant to generalize beyond them. Naming the source type helps the listener understand why the narration stays broad in some places and declines to make a sharper claim. The histories of collection and publication also matter because they remind us that an archive is not the same as an origin. What reaches a university document has traveled through particular hands and institutions. To acknowledge that travel is not to make the traditions distant. It is to avoid pretending that the present record has no conditions of its own. The images themselves remain powerful without enlargement. A canoe on altered water, ground that is no longer reliable. The sea entering a remembered world with a force that leaves a mark on story. Such images do not need a universal origin to be meaningful. They belong to places where water has long shaped travel, food, danger, and memory. This is where the comparative urge can become most tempting. After tablets, epics, Sanskrit texts, mountain landings, riverbeds, a Quiche creation sequence, Hawaiian waters, and new earth on Turtle's Back, it would be easy to arrange all the stories into a single impressive answer. The quieter conclusion is more faithful. Similarity can open a question. It cannot, by itself, make separate records surrender their separate ground. Separate ground is where the comparison should finally rest. Flood stories can seem to invite an enormous map, a line from Mesopotamia outward, a vanished disaster remembered everywhere, or a deep inheritance carried from one prehistoric people to another. These models are not foolish merely because they are ambitious. They are attempts to account for recurring narrative shapes. But they remain models, and the stories are not obliged to arrange themselves neatly around them. This is why the wide map must be held lightly. It can show that water, survival, renewal, and loss recur in many places. It cannot make recurrence into identity. A line drawn across a map is a scholarly proposal about relation, not a path that the narratives are required to have traveled. Michael Fitz-Saul has revised his own account of flood myth distribution. In the work used here, he notes examples in both Laurasian and Gondwana regions, and rejects a simple model of diffusion from the Near East. The revision is significant less as a final answer than as an example of scholarship changing its mind when a broad pattern proves too narrow. A theory that once seemed to place one region at the center becomes more complicated when more traditions and their differences are taken seriously. That revision offers a quiet lesson in method. Comparative work is not strongest when it insists that every new example must fit an older map. It is strongest when the map can be altered by what it has overlooked. Fitz-Saul's revised model is still a model, with the limits that attend broad reconstructions of narrative distribution. It is not a demonstrated history of a single ancient flood tradition. Even a broad comparative model cannot establish that all surviving flood stories preserve eyewitness memory of one global catastrophe. The surviving records have different languages, genres, ages, and routes into archives. A damaged Mesopotamian tablet, a biblical literary text, Atra-hasis account of Deucalion, a Sanskrit Purana, early Chinese traditions, a colonial era Quiche transcription, a Hawaiian manuscript record, an Anish-Aina Bay recreation account, and Pacific Northwest recorded traditions are not pieces of one document scattered by water. No single level of explanation can replace them all. A geological event may be studied as a geological event. A traditional narrative may be read for its own structure and meaning. A proposed relationship between the two can be assessed as a proposal. Keeping these levels distinct is not a refusal to think broadly. It is what allows broad thinking to remain answerable to its sources. They can be placed in conversation without being forced into agreement. A Hawaiian manuscript record keeps a named mountain and sea at its center. The Anish-Aina Bay account preserves New Earth through the help of muskrat and turtle. Pacific Northwest recorded traditions remain tied to coasts, canoes, and changing ground. The sources that make these accounts available also shape how carefully they must be handled. Record does not erase locality. Comparison should not erase it either. Conversation is the gentler word because it allows each account to retain its own question. One story may ask what relation a created being owes to its makers. Another may ask what cooperation makes a renewed world possible. Another may hold a coast in memory through a changed relation between water and land. They may meet around water without arriving at one shared conclusion. This also makes room for silence. Not every tradition has to provide a counterpart to every feature of another. The absence of a boat, a chosen survivor, or a known date is not a defect that needs to be repaired by comparison. It may be the clearest sign that a different story is being told. What returns across the stories is not one settled explanation, but a group of human concerns. Water can undo boundaries. It can make survival depend on warning, work, animals, kinship, interpretation, or a remembered mountain. It can ask how a world begins again, and whether beginning again means rebuilding, restoring a relation, opening a riverbed, or making a small amount of earth sufficient. These concerns are broad enough to be recognizable without becoming a claim of common origin. Communities living with rivers, coasts, seasonal waters, and remembered changes in land would not need a single inherited script in order to think seriously about what water can alter. Nor does a shared concern prevent a particular tradition from giving a wholly particular answer. The recurrence is an invitation to listen, not a proof that listening will end in sameness. Renewal, too, has many scales. It may concern a household, a landscape, a created world, a relation between beings, or an order that must be restored after disruption. By leaving the scale open, the narration can notice a common human seriousness without reducing each account to a symbolic fragment of a larger theory. Those concerns are shared only at a high level. Their answers remain wonderfully unlike one another. Speaks toward reeds because a divine promise has tied his words. Uta-napishti's memory troubles Gilgamesh because it is bound to mortality. Deucalion and Pyrrha read stones as the bones of the earth. Manu follows a fish through a cycle of dissolution and renewal. Works with waterways. The Popol Vuh turns water toward a failed creation. None of these needs to become a disguised chapter in another. The temptation to find one drowned age beneath them all is understandable. A single explanation has the clean shape of a horizon. But old stories have survived because they carry more than one kind of memory. Memory of language, place, ritual, loss, work, and the people who repeated them. Their waters do not join into one ocean merely because they can be drawn on one map. The wish for one origin can also conceal a wish for a simpler past. It promises that every difference might be traced back to one distant moment and made intelligible at once. The sources resist that promise. They arrive with different forms, different histories, and different claims upon attention. Their plurality is not a problem that the conclusion has failed to solve. It is the conclusion's most important fact. To let plurality remain is not to leave the listener with nothing. It leaves a more durable understanding. Stories travel through time in particular ways, and the forms in which they survive matter. A flood can be an image of unmaking, a condition of labor, a remembered sea, or a setting for renewed obligation. The word is shared, the remembered worlds are not. So the final image is not a universal arc drifting above a vanished world. It is a set of separate shores. Clay rests in an archive. A mountain keeps its name. A river continues through a channel. A turtle bears new earth. A coastline remembers that water can change its shape. In each place, the water has receded into a different remembered world.